The riveting gun weighed 9 pounds. It vibrated at 1,800 cycles per minute. The noise was so loud that women went home with their ears ringing, the sound still echoing in their skulls hours after their shifts ended. The aluminum dust got everywhere, in their hair, their clothes, the creases of their skin, their hands blistered, their backs ached, and still they came back, shift after shift, day after day, building the machines that would decide the fate of nations. June 8, 1943, 6:14 in the morning. Inside the General Motors Eastern Aircraft Division plant in North Tarrytown, New York. A 20-year-old woman named Rose Bonavita positioned her rivet gun against the aluminum skin of a Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bomber wing. Her partner and cousin, Jennie Fiorito of Ossining, stood on the opposite side, bucking bar pressed firmly against the metal. The factory floor thundered with the percussion of pneumatic tools. The air hung thick with the smell of hot aluminum and machine oil. Rose took a breath, squeezed the trigger, and began. For the next 6 hours, the two women worked without pause, rivet after rivet, more than 3,345 in total. They also drilled 900 holes. When they finally stepped back, their hands cramped and their ears ringing, they had shattered every production record in the history of American aircraft manufacturing. Navy inspectors approved the wing assembly without requiring a single rework. The New York Sun headline read, "Rosie and Jennie set rivet record." President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself would send Rose a personal letter of commendation. Newspapers across the country printed her photograph. She became, for a brief moment, the most famous factory worker in America. But here is what the newspapers did not report. Within 2 years, Rose Bonavita would be unemployed. Pushed out of the factory she had helped make legendary, replaced by men who had never driven a single rivet. And decades later, her own son, Dr. Joseph Hickey, a physician whose practice included removing toxins from patients, would conclude that the crippling osteoporosis that destroyed her bones was caused by chronic lead exposure from the very rivets that made her famous. She died on January 1, 1996, at 73 years old in Hilton Head, South Carolina. This is not a simple story of patriotic women answering their country's call. This is a story of how America's forgotten factory girls built the greatest air armada in human history, outproduced Nazi Germany by nearly 3-1, and were then systematically erased from the nation they had saved. Before December 7, 1941, the American aircraft industry employed almost no women at all. At Lockheed's massive Burbank plant, exactly 5 women worked on the factory floor. 5. The prevailing wisdom held that women lacked the physical strength, the mechanical aptitude, and the emotional stability for industrial work. Aircraft manufacturing was considered too complex, too dangerous, and too important to entrust to anyone other than skilled men. Union leaders worried that hiring women would undercut wages. Factory managers dismissed the idea as impractical, and the women themselves had been taught since childhood that their place was in the home, not on the assembly line. Then came Pearl Harbor. The attack that killed 2,403 Americans on that Sunday morning in Hawaii did more than drag the United States into a global war. It shattered every assumption about who could do what in American industry. The military would eventually absorb over 16 million men into uniform. The factories that would need to build their weapons were losing workers faster than they could train replacements. Within weeks, the War Production Board set targets that seemed impossible. President Roosevelt demanded 50,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. To put this in perspective, the entire American aircraft industry had produced only 6,000 planes in 1940. Now they were being asked to increase production by a factor of 20 within 2 years. The problem was immediate and devastating. With millions of men being drafted into military service, the factories had no one to operate them. The skilled workers who had built aircraft before the war were disappearing into Army and Navy uniforms at a rate of hundreds of thousands per month. At Boeing in Seattle, the draft notices arrived daily. Lockheed faced the same crisis. So did Douglas, North American, Consolidated, Republic, Grumman, and every other aircraft manufacturer in the country. The solution was obvious. Even if no one wanted to admit it, women would have to build the planes. The transformation happened faster than anyone predicted. By fall of 1942, the aircraft industry had added 63,000 women to its payrolls. By November of 1943, women constituted 37% of the 2.1 million Americans building military aircraft. That was 486,000 women. Across all war industries, 6.7 million additional women entered the workforce, increasing female labor force participation from 27% to 37%. The government machinery that recruited these women operated with unprecedented sophistication. The War Manpower Commission, created in April of 1942, worked alongside the Office of War Information to craft recruitment campaigns specifically designed to overcome cultural resistance. Commissioner Paul McNutt described getting women into industry as a tremendous sales proposition. The slogans were carefully tested. The more women at work, the sooner we win. Longing will not bring him back sooner. Get a war job. If you have used an electric mixer in your kitchen, you can learn to run a drill press. The campaigns worked by deliberately connecting factory skills to domestic abilities. If a woman could sew, the propaganda promised she could rivet. If she could follow a recipe, she could follow an assembly diagram. If she could thread a needle, she could thread wire through an aircraft fuselage. The strategy was psychologically brilliant. It allowed women to enter industrial work without directly challenging the gender assumptions of the era. They were not becoming men. They were simply applying feminine skills to masculine tasks, temporarily, until the men came home. But once inside the factories, these women did far more than anyone expected. The facilities they entered defied human scale. Ford's Willow Run bomber plant, located between Ypsilanti Township and Belleville, Michigan, sprawled across 3.5 million square feet of factory space. It was the largest assembly operation under one roof in the world. Architect Albert Kahn designed it with an assembly line stretching over 1 mile long, featuring 4 massive turntables that allowed a 90-degree turn in the L-shaped building. The turn was necessary because the Wayne County line ran through the property, and Henry Ford refused to pay taxes to 2 different counties. So the entire building turned to keep all operations in Washtenaw County. At peak production, more than 42,000 employees worked at Willow Run, including over 12,000 women who were paid the same 85 cents per hour as their male counterparts. They worked 3 shifts around the clock. The lights never went out. The assembly line never stopped moving. And the B-24 Liberator bombers rolled off the end of the line at a rate that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. 1 completed bomber every 63 minutes. Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle grew from 60,000 square feet in 1936 to 1.776 million square feet by the attack on Pearl Harbor. The entire facility was camouflaged with a 26-acre fake suburban community designed by Hollywood set designer John Stuart Detley of MGM, an Oscar-nominated art director recruited by Colonel John Omer Jr. of the Corps of Engineers. The installation featured artificial streets named Burlap Boulevard and Synthetic Street, fake houses made of burlap and chicken wire standing only 4 to 6 feet tall, plywood trees, and fire hydrants. From the air, it looked like a peaceful neighborhood. Inside, nearly 50,000 workers produced B-17 Flying Fortresses at a rate of 362 per month, roughly 16 complete aircraft per day at peak production. North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, became the single most prolific manufacturer, producing over 40,000 aircraft, 14% of all wartime American output. This included 15,586 P-51 Mustangs, the fighter that turned the air war over Europe by giving bombers long-range escort capability, and 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers. At peak production, the Inglewood plant turned out 857 P-51s in a single month. Douglas Aircraft employed 160,000 workers across multiple plants and produced roughly 29,000 aircraft. Lockheed and its subsidiary Vega employed over 90,000 workers, building P-38 Lightnings and B-17s under license. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego produced B-24 Liberators, eventually becoming Convair. Republic Aviation on Long Island produced P-47 Thunderbolts. Grumman, also on Long Island, produced F-6F Hellcats and TBM Avengers for the Navy. Every one of these companies transformed from predominantly male workforces to workforces where women constituted a third or more of all employees. The women who filled these cathedrals of industry came from every corner of American life. Rose Will Monroe was a widow from Pulaski County, Kentucky, whose husband had died in a car accident, leaving her alone with 2 young children to support. She moved to Michigan in 1942 seeking better wages, and became a riveter at Willow Run, building B-24 Liberators. Actor Walter Pidgeon discovered her during a war bond drive at the plant and cast her in promotional films shown in theaters nationwide because her name, Rose, matched the song Rosie the Riveter that was popular at the time. After the war, she would drive a taxi, run a beauty shop, and eventually found Rose Builders, her own home construction company, building houses with her own hands because no factory would hire her back. At age 50, she finally earned her pilot's license, a dream deferred because wartime regulations had disqualified single mothers from flight training. She joined her local aeronautics club as its only female member. In 1978, her small plane's engine failed during takeoff with her daughter Vicky and 4 others aboard. The passengers were not seriously hurt, but Monroe lost a kidney and the sight in her left eye. She died on May 31, 1997, at 77 years old, from kidney failure related to the crash. A colourful Rosie the Riveter art installation now stands in Ashland Park, Clarksville, Indiana, honouring her memory. Naomi Parker Fraley was born on August 26, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the third of 8 children. She and her sister Ada worked at Naval Air Station Alameda, California, operating metalworking lathes on aircraft assembly. On March 24, 1942, a photographer captured her at the lathe wearing a polka dot bandana, her hair tucked safely away from the spinning machinery. The photograph was distributed by the Acme Wire Service and ran in multiple newspapers, including the Oakland Post-Inquirer, the Milwaukee Journal, and the Pittsburgh Press on July 5, 1942, with the caption, "Pretty Naomi Parker looks like she might catch her nose in the turret lathe she is operating." This image is now believed to be the most likely inspiration for J. Howard Miller's iconic "We Can Do It" poster. For decades, a woman named Geraldine Hoff Doyle was incorrectly credited as the model, an error repeated in countless articles and documentaries. Fraley discovered the error in 2011 when she attended a reunion at the Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park and found her own photograph captioned with Doyle's name. Professor James J. Kimball of Seton Hall University spent 6 years investigating the case and published definitive findings in the journal Rhetoric and Public Affairs in June of 2016, proving that Fraley was the woman in the photograph. Kimball himself noted that the connection between Fraley and Miller's poster remains circumstantial, since Miller died in 1985 without identifying his model. But the photo that was wrongly attributed to Doyle was definitively Fraley's. When Fraley learned she had finally been identified, she exclaimed, "Victory, victory, victory." She spent her post-war years waitressing in Palm Springs, changing homes nearly 3 dozen times, chasing better work, a far cry from the skilled machinist she had been at 20. She died on January 20, 2018, at 96 years old, in Longview, Washington. Elinor Otto began work in January of 1942 at Raw Aircraft in Chula Vista, California, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. She earned 65 cents per hour as a riveter. In her own words, "I was making 65 cents an hour, and at the time it felt like we were rich." She was laid off after the war, like millions of other women, told her services were no longer needed. But unlike most, she returned to aircraft work in 1951 at Ryan Aeronautical and spent nearly 50 years at Douglas Aircraft, which later became McDonnell Douglas and then Boeing. She did not retire voluntarily. When Boeing closed its Long Beach C-17 production line in November of 2014, she was laid off at age 95. She quipped to reporters, "I did not quit. They laid me off." At 5 feet 2 inches and 103 pounds, she had worked on every single C-17 Globemaster, 3 built at the Long Beach plant, 279 aircraft in total. She received the Air Force Association's Lifetime Achievement Award in September of 2017, the only civilian ever so honored. She appeared on The Ellen DeGeneres Show and The Today Show. She was named California State Assembly 70th District Woman of the Year in 2014. She died on November 12, 2023, at 104 years old, after suffering a stroke at her home in North Las Vegas. She had worked in aircraft manufacturing for a combined 68 years of her life. These women learned their skills with astonishing speed. Many plants had no time for formal training programs. "They hired us in right away and there was no time for formal training," Elinor Otto recalled, "so the men had to teach us different jobs as we went along. Training was often compressed to days or weeks before new workers were placed on active production lines. Tools were re-engineered to accommodate women's typically smaller hands and different physical capabilities. Lockheed introduced smaller rivet guns, additional hydraulic lifts, and ergonomic adaptations that their production chief said quickly put women on an equal footing with their male counterparts. Some tasks that had been considered too heavy for women were redesigned with mechanical assistance. Other tasks that required working in cramped spaces actually favored women's typically smaller frames. The results defied every pre-war assumption about female capability. A United States Department of Labor study found that in aircraft manufacturing, women drilled 1,000 holes per day compared to men's 650. A foreman at California Consolidated Aircraft told the Saturday Evening Post, "Nothing gets by them unless it is right." Lockheed executive Cortland Gross observed, "Big airplanes are made up of small parts, and women build small parts to perfection." Women mastered an extraordinary range of technical skills far beyond riveting, arc welding and spot welding, operating drill presses, lathes and milling machines, sheet metal cutting and forming, electrical wiring and harness assembly, operating hydraulic presses and overhead cranes, drop hammer operation, instrument reading and quality inspection, engineering drafting, blueprint reading. At Convair, in November of 1943, 20-year-old Margarita Poletto of Escondido became the plant's first female drop hammer operator, controlling a massive machine that stamped metal parts with thousands of pounds of force. At Grumman, 19-year-old May Nostrand became the company's first female plane captain, responsible for the final inspection of completed aircraft before delivery. The learning curve for Boeing's B-17 production tells the efficiency story in numbers. Building one required over 140,000 labor hours in 1941. By 1944, it required under 20,000. A seven-fold improvement, driven largely by the skills and productivity of a workforce that was increasingly female. But even as women proved themselves on factory floors across America, a darker reality was unfolding. For black women, the struggle was compounded by a brutal racial hierarchy that placed them at the absolute bottom of the hiring order. The documented sequence was explicit. White men with draft deferments were hired first, then white women, then black men, and finally, black women last. Many were not hired until 1944, the final full year of the war. Major aircraft manufacturers openly refused to hire African Americans for anything other than custodial work. North American Aviation President J. H. Kindleberger declared in 1941, "It is against company policy to employ them as aircraft workers or mechanics, regardless of their training." Boeing had never hired a single African American in its 25-plus years of existence. After Executive Order 8802 became law banning discrimination in defense industries, Boeing hired 1,000 new employees per week for 10 consecutive weeks without offering a single position to a black applicant. Boeing blamed the International Association of Machinists Local 75, one union's whites-only oath. The first breakthrough at Boeing came in January of 1942, when Floris Spearman became the first African American ever hired at the company as a stenographer. In April of 1942, Dorothy West Williams became Boeing's first black production worker as a sheet metal worker. Their hiring came after sustained pressure from the NAACP, the Northwest Enterprise newspaper, and the Committee for the Defense of Negro Labor's Right to Work at Boeing. By war's end, Boeing employed 1,600 African Americans, 86% of whom were women. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, signed on June 25, 1941, was the first federal action promoting equal employment opportunity since Reconstruction. It banned discrimination in defense industries because of race, creed, color, or national origin, and created the Fair Employment Practice Committee. The order came only after A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened a march of 100,000 protesters on Washington, with backing from Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt. but the committee had only an $80,000 budget and 11 staff members with no enforcement power. Companies routinely ignored it because there were no meaningful penalties for non-compliance. Integration triggered explosive violence when it did occur. At the Packard Motor Company in Detroit in early 1943, when 3 black women were promoted to operate drill presses, white women immediately walked out and refused to return until the promotions were reversed. Packard management capitulated to the white workers' demands. 3 months later, on June 3, 1943, 3 black men were promoted to the aircraft assembly line. 25,000 white workers walked out in protest. A voice over the factory loudspeaker declared words too hateful to repeat, saying the speaker would rather see Hitler and Hirohito win than work next to a black colleague. The strike ended June 7th, when 30 ringleaders were suspended, and the War Labor Board threatened to draft strikers into the military. Just 2 weeks later, the Detroit race riot erupted, killing 34 people. Despite these obstacles, an estimated 600,000 African-American women worked in wartime industries. Fanny Christina Hill left domestic service in Texas to become a riveter at North American Aviation in Inglewood in 1943, earning 60 cents per hour. She was trained through the Negro Victory Committee. Her sister's famous observation became a family, saying, "Hitler was the one that got us out of the white folks' kitchen." Hill was one of the few black women recalled to work after the war. She remained at North American Aviation, which became Rockwell International, until her retirement in 1980. Nearly 40 years. In the 1960s, she filed an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission grievance against discriminatory practices, won, and received $100 plus a better position. She was born on January 9, 1918, and died on June 30, 2001. Sybil Lewis, a black woman from Oklahoma, worked first at Douglas Aircraft, starting at $1.20 per hour, then as a riveter at Lockheed in Los Angeles. "The women worked in pairs," she recalled. "I was the riveter, and this big, strong white girl from a cotton farm in Arkansas worked as the bucker." When her foreman gave her riveting job to a white woman and reassigned Lewis to the harder bucker position, she recognized it as the same segregation she had experienced back home. Yet she also observed, "It was the first time I had a chance to get out of the kitchen and work in industry and make a few bucks. This was something I had never dreamed would happen." No wartime recruitment posters were created specifically to encourage black women to enter the factories. All government propaganda featured white women exclusively. Their contributions were invisible in the official narrative, erased from the very story they had helped write. The working conditions these women endured tested human limits. Women typically worked 6 days a week in rotating shifts as factories operated around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 12-hour days were common, with overtime heavily encouraged or effectively mandatory to maintain production schedules. The physical environment was punishing. Extreme noise from rivet guns and machinery caused permanent hearing damage. Elinor Otto reported significant hearing loss after decades of factory work. The cramped interior spaces of aircraft fuselages and wings demanded contorted postures for hours at a stretch. Elinda Avila was just 15 years old when she worked as a riveter on B-25 bombers at an aircraft plant near Phoenix. Of Navajo heritage, she belonged to a people who could not even vote at the time. When her brother was drafted and sent to Japan, she went to the army recruiter. "I have come to enlist," she said. "I want to join the army." Turned away because of her gender, she found defense work instead. Her small size proved an asset. "From inside the wings, that is where I used to work," she recalled. "I was little enough I could crawl in the wings. Chemical hazards were pervasive and poorly understood. Workers were routinely exposed to aircraft dope, toxic cellulose compounds sprayed on fabric coverings, along with trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, methyl ethyl ketone, toluene, xylene, carbon tetrachloride, and zinc chromate primers. Many of these substances were later identified as carcinogens or neurotoxins. Studies by the National Institutes of Health later confirmed that workers in paint shops and sheet metal operations showed significant increases in genetic damage markers after just 15 to 30 days of exposure. Physical dangers were constant. Frances Mauro Masters recalled a co-worker at Willow Run who stubbornly refused to wear her bandana, and her beautiful long hair became tangled in a machine. A horrifying accident that could have been fatal. Crane operators worked 60 feet above concrete floors with minimal safety equipment. At Radio Plane in California, a young woman named Norma Jean Doherty worked in the dope room, spraying toxic liquid plastic over cloth for target plane fuselages. An Army photographer spotted her and took publicity photos that launched her modeling career. The world would know her as Marilyn Monroe. The wage gap was stark. In 1944, skilled female workers earned an average of $31.21 per week, while skilled male workers earned $54.65. Women made roughly 57 cents for every dollar earned by men. Some factories like Willow Run paid equal hourly rates of 85 cents, but this was the exception rather than the rule. Childcare was a crisis. Women headed nearly 20% of American households during the war, and female absenteeism in factories ran 4 to 5 times higher than men's, primarily due to childcare breakdowns. Congress allocated $20 million under the Lanham Act in 1943, eventually enrolling an estimated 550,000 children in federally supported childcare, the first and only near-universal federal childcare system in American history. The most celebrated facilities were the Kaiser Child Service Centers in Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon. Located directly at shipyard entrances so mothers could drop off children on their way to shifts, the centers operated 24 hours a day, employed teachers, nurses, dietitians, and social workers, and even offered a home service food program promoted by Eleanor Roosevelt that provided hot dinners mothers could take home, eliminating the need to shop and cook after exhausting shifts. Housing shortages plagued every major production center. Vanport, Oregon, built in 1942 to 1943 by Kaiser to house shipyard workers, became the state's second-largest city with 40,000 residents virtually overnight. San Diego, Mobile, Detroit, and other production centers experienced similar explosive growth as workers flooded in faster than housing could be built. Mary Fierros, a Mexican-American woman born in 1920, worked for Douglas Aircraft Company, riveting B-29 wings, while her husband served in the military. Her arrival was marked by cultural collision. They gave me an apron. I put the apron on, and then they told me, "You have to go get the gun," she recalled. I told them I had never touched a gun, and they told me, "That is a riveter machine, Mary." She faced racial hostility distinct from that experienced by black women. She was required to sit in the back of the bus. When co-workers discovered she was Mexican, they would turn like this, she said, miming people turning away. They did not even want to touch me because I was Mexican. Her partner could not speak English, and Fierros translated, yet wartime secrecy rules meant she never even learned the partner's name. She died in December of 2022 at 102 years old in San Jose. Her funeral mass was held on December 16th. While American women were building the arsenal of democracy, Nazi Germany made a catastrophic strategic blunder rooted in ideology. Hitler's regime confined women to what they called Kinder, Küche, Kirche, meaning children, kitchen, church. At the 1934 Nuremberg rally, Hitler declared, "We do not feel that it is right when a woman forces her way into a man's world." Hermann Göring wrote in the 9 Commandments of the workers' struggle, "Take a pot, a dustpan, and a broom, and marry a man." Before the war, Germany actually had a higher proportion of women in the workforce than the United States, with roughly 15 million women employed. But during the war, while Allied nations dramatically expanded female industrial employment, Germany's female workforce remained essentially flat at 14 to 15 million. Female conscription was introduced only in January of 1943, far too late, and came with so many exemptions for mothers and women with household responsibilities that it barely moved the needle. Rather than challenge Nazi gender ideology, the regime chose what historian Edward L. Homsey called a seemingly easier course: massive exploitation of foreign forced labor. Germany ultimately abducted approximately 12 million people from nearly 20 European countries. By late summer of 1944, 7.6 million foreign civilian workers and prisoners of war were registered in German territory, representing 1/5 of the entire German workforce. Over 500,000 concentration camp inmates were leased to German firms. Aircraft manufacturers, including Junkers, Messerschmitt, Heinkel, BMW, and Fokker-Wulf, all used slave labor extensively. The German approach was not only morally catastrophic, It was less efficient. Forced laborers were malnourished, untrained, and unmotivated. Sabotage was constant. Quality control was impossible. As Donald Douglas of Douglas Aircraft observed, here is proof that free men can outproduce slaves. By 1944, American peak production reached 96,270 aircraft versus Germany's 39,807, a ratio of nearly 2.5 to 1. American factories, safe from Axis bombing, operated continuously while German production was repeatedly disrupted and ultimately dispersed underground. The combined Allied output was overwhelming. The United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union together produced roughly 590,000 aircraft against the Axis total of approximately 207,000. The Allies outproduced the Axis by nearly 3 to 1. In 1944 alone, the United States built more aircraft than Japan manufactured during the entire war. Ford's Willow Run exemplified this industrial dominance. In October of 1942, it produced one plane per month, as workers struggled to master the complex manufacturing process. Skeptics called it, "Will it run?" By April of 1944, it was building 428 B-24 Liberators per month. Between April 24th and 26th of 1944, workers completed 100 bombers in just 3 days. The skeptics had been silenced. The assembly line innovation was revolutionary. Charles Sorensen, Ford's vice president of production, broke the bomber into 11 major assemblies, subdivided into 69 sub-assemblies, each built on separate lines, then mated on the final assembly. A center wing assembly machine completed 42 precision machining operations to .0002-inch tolerance in 17 minutes, work that had taken Consolidated Aircraft 250 man-hours using traditional methods. Total Willow Run output reached approximately 8,685 B-24 Liberators, nearly half of all 18,000 plus B-24s ever built. Then came August of 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over, and everything changed. The reversal was swift and deliberate. The same government agencies that had recruited women now extolled the virtues of giving up their jobs so returning men had work. Posters that had urged women to enter factories now encouraged them to return home. Magazine articles praised the joys of domesticity. The propaganda machine that had celebrated women workers was turned against them with equal effectiveness. Layoffs began immediately as factories converted to peacetime production. Female labor force participation dropped nearly to pre-war levels by spring of 1946. By 1950, women constituted 32% of the workforce, down from the wartime peak of 36%. Women were not legally required to surrender their jobs, but the mechanisms of displacement were overwhelming. The Selective Service Act guaranteed returning veterans the right to reclaim former positions. Union seniority rules, which favored men who had accumulated years before departing for military service, systematically disadvantaged women who had been hired during the war. The GI Bill gave veterans preferential hiring, education benefits, and home loans. Marriage bars, prohibitions on hiring married women that had been suspended during the war, returned in many occupations. The Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor conducted a landmark survey, documented in Bulletin 209, covering 10 war production areas. The findings were devastating in their clarity. 75% of wartime employed women expected to remain in the post-war labor force. Among manufacturing workers, the figure was 84%. Among single women, 96% intended to keep working. Among widowed or divorced women, 98%. These women were not temporary volunteers happy to return home. They were breadwinners, many supporting families alone. Some fought back. In 1945, women workers at a Ford Motor Company plant publicly protested when the company fired them in exchange for less experienced male workers. Several hundred women managed to keep their jobs, but their broader demands went unmet. Most women who had earned 85 to 90 cents per hour in wartime factories found new employment only by accepting pay cuts to 45 to 50 cents per hour. Ottilie Juliet Gattus, laid off from Grumman after 3.5 years, wrote directly to President Roosevelt. "I happen to be a widow with a mother and son to support," she wrote. "I am a lathe hand, and was classified as skilled labor. But simply because I happen to be a woman, I am not wanted. Her letter went unanswered. Josie Dunn, an African-American woman born in Arkansas and raised in Summit, Oklahoma, an all-black town. They was picking cotton when she joined a federal youth program that led her to Boeing in Seattle at 62.5 cents per hour in 1943. She stayed for nearly 4 decades until 1981, one of the longest documented tenures of any Rosie. Her story represents the permanent career transformation that wartime work made possible for some women, particularly black women for whom defense work opened economic doors that never fully closed. She died in 2019 at 98 years old. Inez Sauer was 31 years old with 3 children when she responded to a Boeing newspaper advertisement reading, "Do your part, free a man for service." Born in West Seattle in 1910, she had moved to Akron, Ohio, after marriage and lived in an elegant house with a live-in maid. Her life had revolved around bridge games, golf, and children. She worked as a tool clerk at 46 cents per hour, 7 days a week. Her mother's warning proved prescient. "You will never want to go back to being a housewife." After the war, Sauer confirmed, "I could never go back to playing bridge every day when I knew there were things you could use your mind for. The war changed my life completely. I guess you could say, at 31, I finally grew up." The plant's head superintendent had told the women workers that the happiest day of his life would be when Boeing decided they could not use these women, and he could be there personally to kick them out the door. Black women faced the cruelest reversal. They were first fired and pushed back into domestic service, the very work the war had liberated them from. Post-war non-white unemployment averaged 6.9% versus 4% for whites, jumping to 9.3% versus 4.5% by 1954. Congress did not pass the Equal Pay Act until 1963, 18 years after the war ended. The women who built the arsenal of democracy waited decades for acknowledgement. The first major cultural reckoning came with the life and times of Rosie the Riveter, Connie Field's 1980 documentary that premiered at the New York Film Festival. The film interviewed 5 women, 3 black and 2 white, and juxtaposed their real experiences against wartime propaganda. It won 15 international awards and was selected for the National Film Registry in 1996. The Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park was established on October 24, 2000, when President Clinton signed Public Law 106352. Located in Richmond, California, it preserves the Kaiser Shipyard site where 747 ships were built. The adjacent Rosie the Riveter Memorial became the first national memorial dedicated to women's wartime labor. The highest civilian honor came on December 3, 2020, when President Trump signed the Rosie the Riveter Congressional Gold Medal Act into law. The ceremony took place on April 10, 2024, at the United States Capitol, with 27 living Rosies traveling from across the country to attend. In March of 2025, a commemoration at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans honored 18 surviving women. The medal was awarded collectively to an estimated 5 to 6 million women and will be permanently displayed at the National Museum of American History. Among those honored was Susan Taylor King, born Susan Emmeline Taylor, on July 13, 1924, in Kilmarnock, Virginia. King grew up in racially segregated Baltimore, graduated from Frederick Douglass High School in 1942, earned an aircraft riveting certificate from the National Defense Training Program, and was hired by Eastern Aircraft Company in Baltimore to assemble the elevator section of F-4F Wildcat fighters. At just 105 pounds, her supervisor inspected every rivet with a magnifying glass. Her most striking observation was this: Eastern Aircraft at that time was completely integrated. It was the first time I had ever sat down to eat in a completely integrated institution in my life. Remarkable, given Baltimore's deep segregation. After 10 months of riveting, she enrolled at Morgan State University, earned bachelor's and master's degrees, and became a science teacher and counselor. Now 100 years old, she received her Congressional Gold Medal at the National World War II Museum. Among the champions of recognition, May Creer stands out. Now, in her late 90s, Creer built bombers for Boeing in Seattle at age 17 and spent over 30 years campaigning for Rosie recognition, working alongside the late Phyllis Gould, who helped design the Congressional Gold Medal before dying in 2021 at 99. Betty Reed Soskin, an African-American woman who worked as a file clerk for the Boilermakers A-36 Union during the war, became a ranger at the Richmond National Historical Park and served as the oldest active National Park Service ranger, dedicating her later life to ensuring black women's stories were included in the narrative. The image most people identify as Rosie the Riveter, J. Howard Miller's flexing woman in a red bandana declaring "We can do it," was never actually a recruitment poster. It was an internal morale piece, commissioned by Westinghouse Electric's War Production Coordinating Committee in 1942. Miller designed 42 posters for the company. "We Can Do It" was displayed for exactly 2 weeks in mid-February of 1943 on bulletin boards inside Westinghouse factories. Fewer than 1,800 copies were printed. The woman depicted was making micarta helmet liners, not riveting. The poster was then forgotten for nearly 4 decades until a 1982 Washington Post magazine article reproduced it. The image, actually famous during the war, was Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover, published May 29, 1943. It showed a muscular woman with red hair, rivet gun on her lap, foot planted on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. The model was Mary Doyle Keefe, a Vermont telephone operator who never set foot in a factory. The original painting sold for $4,959,500 at Sotheby's in New York on May 22, 2002. It is now held by the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, which acquired it in 2007. The name Rosie originated with the song Rosie the Riveter, written by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb, released in February of 1943. The real inspiration was Rosalind P. Walter, a 19-year-old from a prosperous Long Island family who worked the night shift building F-4U Corsair fighters at Vought Aircraft in Stratford, Connecticut. Walter later became a prominent philanthropist and PBS board member, dying in 2020. Today, the Oral History Projects at University of California, Berkeley, the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and New York University's Tamiment Library continue to preserve testimonies of the dwindling number of surviving Rosies. Francis Morrow Masters, who recalled the hair caught in a machine at Willow Run, was honored with a bronze Rosie the Riveter statue at the Michigan World War II Legacy Memorial in Royal Oak on Veterans Day, November 2025. She was 103 years old. A children's book titled I Would Do It Again tells her story. The factories where these women worked have mostly vanished. Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, where workers built B-17s under Hollywood camouflage, was demolished. The fake suburban neighborhood that concealed it exists only in photographs. Willow Run stood until portions were demolished, though preservation efforts saved parts of the historic structure. The Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park in Richmond remains as the primary physical memorial to their labor. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 295,959 military aircraft. Women helped build nearly all of them. They riveted, they welded, they wired, they assembled. They worked 12-hour shifts in toxic fumes and deafening noise. They left their children in the first federal childcare system the nation had ever created. They broke production records that still stagger the imagination. Rose Bonavita drove more than 3,345 rivets in 6 hours on June 8, 1943. President Roosevelt sent her a personal letter of commendation. Within 2 years, she was unemployed. The Congressional Gold Medal arrived in 2024. Most of the women it honored were already gone. But for those who remain, for the centenarians who still remember the thunder of the assembly lines and the weight of the rivet guns in their hands, the recognition finally arrived. They built the sky, they won the war, and then America forgot them, until now.